The meat was still fresh when the neighbors arrived. Chunks of lung, muscle, and cartilage scattered across 200 yards of open field in Rankin County, Kentucky, fallen from a sky that was, by every account, completely clear. No storm, no clouds, no explanation a person could point to. It was the morning of March 9, 1876. A woman named Mrs. Allen Crouch had been outside making soap when the pieces began to fall around her. She did not run, she watched. And what she saw would be written down, disputed, and then quietly set aside. Welcome to the Grim Archive. Tonight's file, the Kentucky Meat Shower. The event was first reported in the Scientific American in the spring of 1876. The account was brief. A correspondent named L.D. Castenbein, a physician, had gathered what information he could from the area. The debris field stretched roughly 100 yards wide and several hundred yards long. The pieces varied in size. Some were small strips, others were larger. One reported chunk measured approximately 4 inches square. The sky, every witness agreed, had been entirely clear. No plausible source was immediately offered. Mrs. Crouch was the primary witness. Her name appeared in the record only as the wife of Allen Crouch, a convention of the time that already tells you something about what the record considered important. She was alone on the property when it happened. Her husband was not present. No farmhand, no neighbor, no corroborating set of eyes stood beside her as the pieces fell. She described the shower lasting roughly 1 to 2 minutes. She described the sky as clear and blue. She described with apparent calm the moment she realized the pieces falling around her were meat. That account was all the scientific community would have to work with. In the days that followed, samples were collected. Some were preserved. This was not routine. In 1876, the infrastructure for collecting and transporting biological specimens from a rural Kentucky field to a qualified laboratory was neither simple nor guaranteed. Someone, accounts do not fully clarify who, thought to salt and preserve portions of the debris before they deteriorated further. That decision would matter enormously, because the meat shower, as strange as it was, might have remained a rural curiosity, a footnote, a story told at county fairs. The preserved samples changed what was possible. They made analysis conceivable. And 2 men, neither of whom had been anywhere near Kentucky that morning, would take up the work. The 2 men were Dr. A. Meade Edwards, president of the Newark Scientific Association, and Dr. W. A. Harple, a physician. Their analysis was published later in 1876 in the Journal of the Newark Scientific Association. What they found was not what anyone had expected, or perhaps it was exactly what the evidence demanded, and the world simply was not ready for it. Working from the preserved samples, Edwards and Harple identified multiple distinct tissue types. The debris was not from one animal. It was not from 2. Across the collected samples, they cataloged tissue consistent with at least half a dozen species. The question was no longer whether it had happened. The question was, how? The species identified in the debris included bear, deer, lamb, horse, and several species of bird. Some identifications were tentative. The state of preservation was imperfect. The analytical tools of 1876 were limited, and Edwards and Harple were candid about the margins of uncertainty in their findings. But the core conclusion held. The material that had fallen on Mrs. Crouch's farm represented the remains of multiple large and small animals, none of them obviously connected to any single local source. The tissue was not decomposed. It was not old. Whatever had lifted these animals into the sky had done so recently, and with enough force to scatter them across a field the size of several city blocks. The leading hypothesis that emerged, and the one that has survived closest scrutiny, involved vultures. Turkey vultures are known to travel in groups. They are also known, when startled or threatened, to disgorge the contents of their stomachs rapidly, a defensive behavior that reduces their weight for flight. The hypothesis suggested that a group of vultures, feeding on one or more large animal carcasses, had been disturbed in flight and simultaneously expelled partially digested material. The updrafts above the Kentucky landscape in March could, theoretically, have scattered that material over a wide area. It was a reasonable hypothesis. It remains the most cited. but it answered only some of the questions the debris field raised. The vulture hypothesis did not explain bear. Turkey vultures do not typically feed on bear carcasses. The identified bear tissue was not a small fragment. It was substantial enough to be identified with reasonable confidence. Nor did the hypothesis account cleanly for the distribution pattern. The debris fell in a relatively narrow corridor, which suggested a moving source, not a stationary disturbance. Edwards and Harpel noted these inconsistencies in their published findings. They did not overstate them. They recorded them carefully, in the language of men who understood that the record they were creating might outlast their ability to explain it. The paper was published. It was not widely circulated. It was not debated in the major journals of the day. The paper was ignored, in part because of who had witnessed the event. Mrs. Crouch's account was the foundation of everything: the timing, the duration, the sky conditions, the distribution. Without her testimony, there was no event, only some preserved tissue of uncertain origin. But Mrs. Crouch was a woman, alone, on a farm, in 1876. The Scientific American correspondent who first reported the story noted her account with a kind of careful distance. Other commentators were less restrained. A lone woman's word in that era carried a specific institutional weight. Which is to say, it carried very little. The debris was real, the samples were real, the science was real, the witness was doubted anyway. The event was not forgotten entirely. It resurfaced periodically in collections of anomalous phenomena, most notably in the writings of Charles Fort, who catalogued unexplained events with a methodical skepticism that the mainstream scientific press of his era did not always share. Fort included the Kentucky meat shower in his 1919 book, The Book of the Damned, alongside dozens of similar reported falls of organic and inorganic material. He did not explain them. He simply refused to let them be erased. Fort's work was not taken seriously by academic science, but it preserved the record, and preservation in this case turned out to matter more than explanation. The samples were gone. The witnesses were gone. The record was all that remained. Modern atmospheric scientists have revisited the vulture hypothesis and found it the most mechanically plausible explanation available. The behavior is documented. The physics are workable. The species diversity in the debris remains harder to account for cleanly. Bear tissue, in particular, has never been satisfactorily explained within the vulture framework, but no competing theory has produced a better fit. What has not been revisited, at least not formally, is the question of Mrs. Crouch herself. Her name does not appear in the scientific literature as a credited observer. The event she witnessed is named for a county and a phenomenon. Not for her. The woman who stood in the field and watched the sky fall remains a footnote to her own story. Two scientists ate the preserved meat. They cataloged what they found. They published their results honestly, with appropriate uncertainty, in the correct venue. The work was sound. The establishment moved on. The witness was doubted. The samples deteriorated. The record survived only because one man thought anomalies were worth keeping. There is no resolution here, only a debris field that was real, a woman whose word was insufficient, and a set of findings that sat in a journal for nearly a century before anyone looked again. Science keeps better records than it keeps faith with them. The next story falls just as quietly. The archive is always open.